Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Hong Kong U Museum Society, I would like to welcome you all to the Forgotten Heritage Bishop Hill Service Reservoir Talk. My name is Michelle. I'm one of the executive committee members of the Hong Kong U Museum Society and the moderator for today's talk. Just some housekeeping matters before we begin. For this webinar, our panelists won't be able to see or hear you, so if you have any questions for our speakers, please send them via the chat box by 3:30. There will be a short Q&A session at the end. This talk will be recorded and will be made available to the public on YouTube in the next few weeks. We would like to thank Florian and his team here at the University Museum and Art Gallery for the help in facilitating this webinar. We also want to thank the Hong Kong Institute of Architectural Conservationists, the Hong Kong Architecture Center, and the Environmental Association for their support and all of you for joining us today. Without further ado, it is my honor to introduce you to our speakers one by one for today's talk, three powerhouses in their respective field. Our first speaker is Dr. Joseph Ting. Dr. Ting is currently an honorary professor in the School of Chinese at the University of Hong Kong, as well as an adjunct professor in the Department of History at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Dr. Ting was also the chief curator of the Hong Kong Museum of History for 12 years before retiring in 2007.
Dr. Ting?
Hong Kong Museum. So this afternoon, I'm going to talk about the naming of the hill, which one find the surface reservoir. Now I'm not going to talk about the history of the reservoir because we have expert here this afternoon. So I'm going to focus on the naming, the nomenclature of this hill. Well, because I think very few people would have heard of this name, Bishop Hill, but not until December last year. I mean, all of a sudden, because of the discovery of the surface reservoir at the top of the hill, I mean, it became sort of top of the town. And but this afternoon, I'm going to talk about the name, whether it should be Bishop Hill or Mission Hill. I think I'll let you to decide at the end of the talk. So before going into to talk about this hill, I'm going to talk a bit about the historical background and geographical background of the hill. Now, first of all, I mean, just for everybody to recall, Hong Kong was ceded to the British by the Treaty of Nanking. It was signed on board a ship called HMS Cornwallis on the 29th of August, 1842. So by August next year, it will be the 180th year of the signing of the Treaty of Nanking. Now, by the third article of that treaty, Hong Kong was ceded to the British. I mean, this is a Chinese version, if you could read it. It's actually quite awkward. The wording is quite awkward in a way. And if you compare it with the English version, there are some differences. So, I mean, but of course you have to read it carefully. Now, in this, it say that the Emperor of China, I can read it. To Her Majesty of Great Britain, the island of Hong Kong, to be possessed in perpetuity by the Britannic Majesty, her heirs and successors, and to be governed by such laws and regulations as Her Majesty, the Queen of Great Britain, shall see fit to desire. So this is the wording of the third article of the Treaty of Nanking, which ceded the island of Hong Kong to the British. Now, so you can see this is we are talking about the island of Hong Kong. Well, actually the British, they want to take Hong Kong because of the harbor. Actually, they are very interested in the Victoria Harbor. Okay, then 20 years later, I mean, we have the Second Opium War, and at the end of it, we have the Treaty of Peking, 1860, which was signed in Peking, of course. And by this treaty, the southern part of the Kowloon Peninsula, and including the island of Stonecutters, were ceded to the British by this treaty. So we can see here, this is a map which was attached to the treaty. So it shows very carefully that the boundary, the northern boundary was somewhere to the north of Bagokzui, and also includes the Stonecutters Island as well. So so later this boundary became Boundary Street. I mean, the original frontier between British Kowloon and what we call the new territories later became known as the Boundary Street. And this is the third treaty. The third treaty is extension of the Hong Kong territory. So this is, in Chinese, we call it 剪到香港界址專條. And by this treaty, the area north of Boundary Street all the way to Shenzhen River was leased. This time it's not ceded. This time it's leased to the British for 99 years. And that's why we have the 1997, we have the June 30th, 1997, we have the return of Hong Kong to China because of this treaty. Okay, this is the map which shows the area which was included in this what we call the convention. Included, I mean, it included all the area. This is now which belongs to the Hong Kong region. This picture shows the surveying of the boundary in Sha Tau Kok by Frederick Lockhart and also a Chinese official. This is in Sha Tau Kok. I mean, they went village by village to mark the boundary. I think the most intriguing part is the Sha Tau Kok, because otherwise it's basically along the river, basically along the Shenzhen River. But in Sha Tau Kok, it's a bit tricky. I mean, to mark out the boundary. Now, this is a map you can show. It shows the island of Hong Kong, and then the southern part of the Kowloon Peninsula, which are all marked in pink color, where the rest belongs to what we call the new territories. Okay, we come to this hill. I think the only structure you see on this hill is the building to the left of the hill. So I'm going to focus on that in the later part of my talk. So the front part is actually the Police Recreation Club. It's nowadays the Police Recreation Club. And formerly it was a football field. I still remember when we failed to buy a ticket for a very major match, people would climb up to the hill and watch. Now, this is a very interesting map. This is the first map which shows this hill. This one, this is the hill, see? Mm-hmm. This is the hill which is now widely known as Bishop Hill. The interesting part of it is it's somehow just north of the boundary. So this is the boundary, you see. This is marked as Old Frontier. So in 1902, we don't have the boundary street. It's still known to be the frontier. Although, I mean, the two parts already, they were governed by the British. One more interesting part, you can find Kowloon Tong here. Those who are familiar with geography would be very surprised to see Kowloon Tong in this location, because the present day Kowloon Tong is not in this location. That means the original Kowloon Tong village was located at the foot of this Bishop Hill. This is what we call Kowloon Tong. And that's why, because we have the Kowloon Tong here, we have the Tong Mei here. because of the same Tong. We have the Kowloon Tong, and then we have the Tong Mei. And later, I think in the later 20s, some British and Chinese and Portuguese merchants, they're developers, they sort of come up with this plan of developing a garden city, what we call the garden city. And then that later became the Kowloon Tong that we know today. The Kowloon Tong. But the original Kowloon Tong village should be located at the foot of this hill. And when you look at this map, there's nothing here. Apart from, there's nothing here actually. And you can see Yunzhou and Tianliu. These are the original villages in Sham Shui Po. So Yunzhou, nowadays we have Yunzhou Gai, Yunzhou Street. But Yunzhou is actually a small village located in Sham Shui Po, in this area. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the Basel Mission in Hong Kong. As you can see, this is Kowloon Tong village. Can you see some of the village house here? This is the Kowloon Tong village. And up on the hill, you see a building. That's the building of the Basel House. So the Basel House has for a very long time, well, perhaps up to this date, the only visible structure that one can see. Because when you talk about the surface reservoir, it's actually underground. It's at the top of the hill, but it's underground. You cannot see it here. So the only visible structure is the Basel House. Well, where they come from? Well, we're talking about the Basel Mission. Basel is a city in the northern part of Switzerland. It's very close to Germany. Actually, the people there speak German. So two missionaries, namely Theodor Hemberg and there's Rudolf Lechler. They first arrived in 1847. Actually, they were invited by a German Lutheran missionary called Karl Gustav. Karl Gustav is a very famous person. He was a missionary, but on the other hand, he was the interpreter during the negotiation for the Peking for the Treaty of Nanjing. And on the other hand, if you read books published in China, he's always considered to be a spy. So, depending on how you look at it, he's a very complicated person. But it was he who invited Basel Mission to Hong Kong. So the two missionaries came to Hong Kong and they adopt the local, the Chinese way of life. They're wearing Chinese clothes and actually wear a kilt. They shave off their hair and actually behave like a Chinese. And they start learning the Chinese language. What kind of Chinese language? They learn Hakka in order that they could sort of spread the gospel in the eastern part of Guangdong. And actually, even in Hong Kong, you go to the new territories. Basically, the eastern part of NT speak Hakka. And so there are a lot of Hakka people here in town. And they learn Hakka in Hong Kong. So while missionary work was primarily conducted in the eastern part of Guangdong province, the missionary have their base in Hong Kong. So this is true for the Protestants as well for the Catholics. For the Catholic, they also use Hong Kong as a base, and they learn the Hakka or Chiuzhou or Cantonese or whatever, and then they go to preach in different parts of Guangdong province. But with the Basel Mission, they have the base in Hong Kong, and in the course of time, they set up some churches and schools in different parts of Hong Kong, in Sai Ying Pun, in Sao Kei Wan, and also in Sham Shui Po. So, everybody could recognize this. This is very close to Hong Kong U. This is Kowloon Tong. This was built in 1932. But before that, they have a much smaller and modest church here. Well, the history could trace back to 1852, very early. And the other one you can see is, this is very interesting. This is Tymon. And actually it's on Basel Road. I think very few people are aware that there's actually a Basel Road in South Taiwan. It's actually at the end of, almost towards the end of Dong Dai Gai. It's still there actually. So you can find that because of this, you could understand that all these places, they were Hakka people living in this place. That's why the Basel Mission are so interested in them, because they're all Hakka people. And these churches, I think originally they all speak Hakka. So we can see they have also opened up the schools for the young kids, so that they have opportunity to receive education. Now, we come to this most important part. In 1905, it's in 1905, the Basel Mission purchased New Kowloon Inland Lot Number 1. I'm going to tell you more about what to mean by New Kowloon later. So they purchased New Kowloon Inland Lot Number 1 and Inland Lot Number 1386, which is actually the 58th of Typo Road. And they built a Basel House. So the Basel House that we saw earlier on the slope of the hill was built in 1905. And it became the headquarters of the Basel Mission in Hong Kong. So, well, I mean, the Western missionaries, they study Chinese language, they train the Chinese missionaries and serve as a place for the Western missionaries to rest and recover before returning to the missions. And when you remember Bethany, which is on the western, near the Porphyrion Road in Hong Kong Island, it's used for the French mission for the same purpose, actually. So this is very common in those days to have a headquarters here. And they consider this is a very safe place because at that time, it was under British rule. And it was, I mean, the villagers in Guangdong could be quite hostile. Because I think in the beginning, they want to preach in both the Hakka area and the Qiuzhou area, but they find the Qiuzhou people very hostile. So they decided to drop the idea and focus on the Hakka people, which are more friendly. So you can know, so now you understand what's the purpose of this building. It's the Basel Mission. So the surface reservoir, which are our great interest, was also built around this time. I mean, just I mean, at the very early part of the 20th century. Okay, this is a wonderful map. This is 1924. In this map, you can see here surface reservoir. Can you see it? It's almost at the top of the hill. You see surface reservoir. But on the slope, you can see New Kowloon Inland Lot Number 1. Okay, so this clearly marks the location of the Basel House, which is on the hill. So they bought this piece of land and built this house here. And by this time, the Kowloon village, the Kowloon Tong village is still there. I mean, it has not been removed. It's still there. You can see some, I mean, the village houses are still there. And the other part of the hill were actually used as cemeteries. Well, actually, if you look back into history, I mean, I would say a lot of the hills in the Kowloon had once been used as a cemetery. It's only after the Second World War that the government decided, because of the influx of people coming from mainland China as a result of the Civil War. So they decided to sort of vacate all the cemeteries And instead, they built a huge one in Shek. And that's why we have a big, very big cemetery in Shek, because they vacate all the cemeteries in the urban area. So here you can find inland lot number 1. Okay. Still in 1924, we don't have boundary street. It's still called the old frontier. What do you mean by New Kowloon? I think this is a very, this is very, very tricky actually. And I don't think many people knew what New Kowloon is. Now, New Kowloon refers to the area north of Boundary Street, but south of the ranges of Lion, Rock, Beacon Hill, Kowloon Peak, and Tasking. That means from Hong Kong, if we look towards the north, towards Kowloon Peninsula, we can see a range of hills which separate the urban area with the rural area. I mean, it used to be a rural area, of course, the NT. So the British were very clever and, well, also very cunning. They acknowledged that this part of the leased land is connected with the British Kowloon, and the way the people is similar. So they decided to regard this as part of Kowloon, part of old Kowloon, and to govern it in the same way under the same system. Instead of in the NT, they have a completely different system in governing the people in NT. So, but because by naming this New Kowloon, this part of Kowloon is sort of merged with the British Kowloon. This is a very good map. You can see very clearly, this is what we mean by New Kowloon. It includes the area of Sham Shui Po, and then we came Kowloon Tong all the way to Kwun Tong, Ngau Chi Wan. I mean, all these area to the north of the original boundary. This part is considered to be New Kowloon. And so by sort of making this difference, they merged this part with the southern part of Kowloon Peninsula to become the same area. So the Basel House was sold to the Songzhen Mission of Hong Kong in 1951. Well, I think I need to explain a bit about this because Basel Mission were missionaries coming from Europe. But later, I think in the 1910s, in the 1920s, nationalism becomes to rise in China. And the people consider the foreign missionaries as, well, somebody from outside. And they sort of link it with some of the imperialists, sort of. So in order to, so the local converts, they decided to set up their own church and gradually separated from the original mission coming from Europe. So they became sort of self-independent. They self-financing. So I mean self-propagating. So this is what we call the Samji. They decided to set up their own church. So this is the Songzhen Hui. But you can see an interesting part is, it doesn't mean that the Basel House was given to the Songzhen Hui. They were sold to the Songzhen Hui. So you see the difference. Okay, so after that, they set up a primary school and then a secondary school. And the original house was put down and replaced by a new church in 1989. Now, this information will come from the scholar Thomas Xi, is an expert in history of Christianity in Hong Kong. He actually, I think, set up an exhibition here a couple of years ago. And he gave a talk also. I attended that talk, very interesting. Okay. Here you can see a series of photographs coming from the Basel Mission Archive. They have lots of photographs, very good photographs. So here you can see, this is what they call the Bishop Hill, and this is the Basel House. You may ask where is this steps? This is actually very close to the police recreation club, very close to that. I'm going to show you later. I just taken a photograph yesterday. Now, also another photo. Now, I think most of these photos were taken after the Second World War, after I think in 47 and 48. So you could see the difference in the Sham Shui Po area. I mean, it's all built up. This is another good photograph showing the Basel House. It's actually quite big, actually. I think this one is 48. The former one was, this former one is 47. So after the Second World War, it's quite dilapidated. And so they sort of try to refurnish it. So this is 48. And now if you, walk along the police recreation club, you could see there's some work going on. I mean, that's the location of the original Basel House. The Basel House had been pulled down, but replaced by a primary school and a church. Now, this is the stairs which leads to the Songdan Church. So if you compare this with so I think it's this location. And this is, you can see Songdan, the character Songdan from another angle. Now, this is interesting. This is taken from Wikipedia. Well, actually, I think they have done some research and found that in the 50s, in the 60s, and even in the 70s, they call this hill Gao Wei Shan, which means Mission Hill. And you can see in 1957, the government asked for the removal of all the cemeteries on the hill. So that cemetery, of course, some people would have buried there as well, because a couple of hills in that area has been used as a cemetery. And after the, after the 1949, that hill has also been used. There are lots of squatters there. So you can see a lot of squatters, but actually at that time, because of the influx of the people from mainland China, and they could hardly find a house, and so many of them they just built squatters along the hills. So this is also the same case for Bishop Hill. You can see a lot of squatters. And in 1968, they actually bought their own generator. the residents in the Mission Hill, they bought their own electrical generator. And then in 1972, eventually they remove all the residents out. It's 1,900. Oh, it's quite a big number. That means there are lots of squatters there. We have 1,900 residents. So it's quite a number. And in 1977, we find something very unfortunate, because I think after the vacation of all the former squatters, this part has become quite, very few people come to this place. And as a result, we find 3 girls were sort of raped on this hill. And they were, the person was sort of jailed for 6 years because of that. So this is all from Wikipedia. So you can know that even in Chinese, this place has always been known as Mission Hill, Gao Wei Shan. Okay. So, Bishop Hill, Mission Hill. So what do you think? So that's the end of my talk. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ting. So we can have a vote, right? We can have a vote after this whether we should call it Bishop Hill or Mission Hill. Thank you, Dr. Ting, for a wonderful history lesson. Our second speaker is Mr. Tymon Mellor. Mr. Mellor is a civil engineer who has been involved with the design and construction of many recent Hong Kong infrastructure projects. He created and runs the hkmaps.hk website, which now has nearly 100 historic maps of Hong Kong and Southern China. Mr. Mellor, welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me just work out how to share my screen and we'll get going. It's one of the buttons here. Gosh, I knew where to look for this. Okay, share screen. All right, now hopefully you can see the screen and we can get going. What I want to talk to you all about today is just about sort of the history of the engineering behind this and some of the politics that was involved with the construction of the reservoirs and these waterworks, because it's sort of reflective of a number of issues. If we then just sort of start with the background, the works there were called the Kowloon Gravitational Scheme. A gravitational scheme was an idea developed in Britain in around 1820, 1830. To supply water to the growing industrial areas. Prior to that, everyone had relied on wells or just local streams and a very local supply. With the industrialization of England, and they then cascaded this approach out throughout the colonies, they adopted an approach that had been used by the mill owners in the past. And that was to basically capture water behind an embankment and then pipe it through to tanks and then distribute by mains to the households. And I mean, that seems very basic and simple to us now, but it was quite a revolutionary approach. And it became the de facto approach for supplying water. Now, of course, in Hong Kong, we're not short of water. We get about 2.5 meters nearly of rain a year. So there's no shortage of water. But what we do have is a shortage of supplies. We don't have any rivers or any lakes. So until there was a distribution system, everyone was relying extensively on wells or whatever little streams there were on the hillsides. But none of that water was treated. It was clearly, it wasn't covered, and there was clearly the risk of pollution from both erosion and human activities. So something had to be, you had to take proactive measures to provide yourself with a safe water supply. As Dr. Tang has reminded us, the history of taking over or the acquisition of Kowloon, when they took over, they realized that they needed to provide a water supply. There were nearly 13,000 people living there. And they realized that there was also an extensive troops were living down in Kowloon, and they all needed water. And so there was a big discussion on how to do it. So a gentleman called Osbert Chadwick, who was the British government sort of a special advisor on sanitary conditions, he came up with a scheme, which was to provide a piped water supply to Kowloon. But this wasn't very popular, strangely. The sort of eminent members of society thought it was basically an approach to just waste money. And we've never heard this approach before. They thought they were just going to waste it on vested interest. But the actual population, they weren't keen either, because they were concerned that it was just going to lead to an increase in taxation and corruption. And so there was quite a lot of resistance. So getting these proposals through took a bit of doing. But by 1892, a scheme had been developed up, which was to utilize 3 wells at the back of Kowloon, and then take that water to a pumping station, then pump that up to a service reservoir, then use gravity feed to supply the pipework around Kowloon. And there was going to be a secondary reservoir over the back of Hung Hom on the hillside there. So this scheme was developed up and implemented, and they started supplying water in 1895, and just day before Christmas in 1895. This imagery here is from the 1924 aerial image of Kowloon. You can see it's a very different Kowloon to the one we recognise now, a very barren hillside areas. The area had been used by the military for shooting ranges and doing whatever military people like to do in these areas. But they established these 3 wells, and you can see from the images there what they look like. And they brought the water into the town. These are where the wells are located now. So well number 2 is up here on Argyle Street junction with Princess Street. Well number 1 here is off Waterloo Road by the Kowloon Library, and well number 3 here is by the junction of Princess Margaret Road and Kings Park. And they then were supplied to this service reservoir here on the hill in Kings Park, and the pumping station here in the back of Moncock. We'll have a look at that in a moment. This is the service reservoir. It's still in use, and it was recently given protected status. People have been in it, but there's a gas problem there, which is why people generally don't go in it at the moment. They are trying to sort out whether they can provide access to it. And you can see the pumping station here, which is now down on the back of Shanghai Street. Let's go and have a look at, and then of course, then as I mentioned, there's the reservoir that was put in at Hung Hom. Now, the Hung Hom tank is interesting because it's the only infrastructure we've actually got drawings left for. I've been looking at drawings. This is the drawing for the tank. You can just see it here on this 1947 image, this green patch here. My overlay clearly didn't work too well. I missed it by about 20 meters, but you can just see that overlay there where the tank is. This tank was exposed in '62 when they were leveling the area for the new Valley Road estate. But at the time, they didn't know what it was for. And some lady who worked in a cooked food stand advised them that it was a Japanese secret headquarters and an underground club and brothel. Unlikely, because the access into this would have been down through a single shaft. There were, however, at the bottom of the hill here, coming to the hillside here, there's a series of tunnels associated with the air raid precaution tunnels, the ARP tunnels, network K5. This was grouted up and demolished as part of the MTR works for the new station. But again, this reservoir was demolished in '62 for the Valley Road estate. Then, of course, we have the pumping station. Here's the pumping station. It's quite a good-looking building, as they say. It had a steam boilers to work the pump, to pump the water up the hill. There was 3 primary buildings and a chimney. Only 1 building is left there, but it's now protected as well, so that's there for everyone to see. The building, once they built the new reservoir in Kowloon, the building was no longer needed and was then converted in about 1910, 1911, got converted to other uses. Part of it became a post office, part of it became stores, and eventually it was used for street sleepers until it was then protected and converted. So this water supply worked very well. It had its limitations. But the population kept growing in Kowloon. And so within a few years, it became very clear that they couldn't supply enough water for the growing population and they needed a bigger scheme. They tried to enhance the wells. They tried to tap into water supplies from the back of Kowloon, but they had limitations. However, they were fortunate, as Dr. Tang said, the lease of Kowloon, of New Territories, was taken out under the Convention of 1898, which then provided them access to the whole of the hills at the back of Kowloon. And as Mr. Stewart noted when he did his tour of the New Territories, he could see that there was an opportunity to build some reservoirs and supply the Kowloon with water. So the next thing they had to do, they had to go and look for possible sources. The first problem they had was they didn't have any maps of the area. They had very limited mapping, but they did get some mapping. They walked around and they identified 5 possible sites. Site number 1 was they were going to build a dam across the valley, and this is this is the general location of Kowloon Reservoir. You can just see here, here's the Typo Road going through over Typo Hill. That's the Typo Road. They were going to put a dam there. Option 2 was to put a dam on the hillside here. And then option 3 was 3, 4, and 5 were to pick up the rivers, and the rivers could supply water, but they couldn't store it. So there was no storage available. So they had a limited ability. So they looked at they studied the approach and picked the number 1, the dam up in the hill would be the best solution. So they went off and did some design work, and they designed themselves a storage reservoir with a 20-meter high earth dam. And so this would have a central core of concrete, earth for either side. That would provide the dam for the reservoir. They'd have some catch waters. They'd have filter beds on Typo Road. They'd need a caretaker bungalow, and they needed a new service reservoir down by Kowloon, which would then become what we call the Bishop Hill Reservoir. They're going to have new water mains, and for the first time put fire hydrants in. The original system, they didn't have the capacity for fire hydrants, so this scheme would have fire hydrants. The scheme was mulled over, and Chadwick had a look at it, and he provided some ideas and some suggestions. He wanted to build the whole dam out of masonry or concrete. He was very concerned it could get washed away with the intense rainfall. He wanted cut-offs, and he suggested then that they only abandon the wells once they proved the new scheme worked. Ormsby, who was the director of work, he was very concerned there was no rock in the area, and that's why they hadn't wanted to put a masonry dam up. But they did a site inspection and they found rock. They also decided to move the dam lower down the river, where there was a narrower cleft, and they could then build a higher dam, and then they could then clearly get a larger volume behind the dam. So in terms of, this was the area they were looking at. Here's the old Type O road running up here. Their first dam was going to be located at this location here and would give them a capacity of 120 million gallons. But on inspection, they realized there was a narrowing of the valley just here. And as you can see, they've put a straight on, they're going to build a dam there. And with a dam in that position, you could then get 310 million gallon capacity, a much larger facility. So this was then the scheme. They got some consultants on board, Dennis, Ram and Gibbs. Now, Gibbs used to work for the government. He was the man that did the original study, but he had joined this consultancy, and they became quite a big company. They did this job. They also designed the post office, and they did some work on Jubilee Road and some public buildings on the island. So they worked up the scheme, but the costs have now increased from 380,000 to 835, primarily due to the significant increase in the dam size. So this was going to be the scheme. We'd have the dam here, which had a catchment area of about 438 acres, but by including a catchwater along the north of the hillsides, that gave them an additional 600 acres. So they were then confident the dam would stay full throughout even the dry winters. So this was the scheme they ended up with. They had the main dam across the river. They had what they call the bywash dam, which is with the overflow. They had a little catchwater on this side and the main catchwater running around the north. They had a caretaker's bungalow, and they built a pipeline that ran down the valley, across a bridge, through a tunnel to the filter beds. And from the filter beds, they would supply water down to the boats, or then down along Old Type O road into the tunnel, into town. The actual dam itself, the original dam was going to be a straight dam across the valley, as you can see from the 1904 map. But by the time they actually built it, and when you go out there today, you can see it's got a beautiful curve on it, which gives it a very majestic looking. This is not. This was due to the construction problems when they started building. They cleared the scrub and got down to the rock and discovered it was heavily jointed. So they had to then dig out the soft material, replace it with concrete, and then grout up under the dam to stop water washing through. So the foundations were complete by about in 1904. Then they started work on the bywash dam, which is this other structure which is basically the overflow. So when it rains, if the dam gets too full, it overflows over this bywash dam. This is the dam. They started building it. They got the foundations got sorted out. They started coming up, but the company building it ran into financial problems, and you can just about see there's a sort of a nominal mark around there. They actually got to that point and had to stop because the company had no more money left. But they got high enough up they could start impounding, or started the water, collecting the water. And so by December 1906, 11 years after the original scheme was commenced, they could start supplying water to Kowloon. However, there was limited progress the next few years, and then in 1910 they got a new contractor on board, and he completed the structure by the end of 1910. So when we look at the facilities now, you'll see it's all got 1910 on it, but it was actually completed much earlier. The final structure, 374 million gallons. You know, this is a dam, 183 meters long. It's 34 meters high, so it's quite a high dam, and it's about 22 meters thick at the bottom. An impressive piece of work for the time. The bywash structure is 43 meters long, 7 meters high. As I say, this originally had some sluice gates in it, so they could vary the heights of the water and let water down. but they've since gone and it's been changed with an infill sort of stone concrete. There's a number of structures are built for the thing. We've got the valve house, which is where you extract the water out, and that's got the 1910 on it, and the recorder houses that monitor the levels of the water and record that. As I mentioned, there's a pipeline from the dam. This is the bridge. It comes across down the valley. It then goes through a tunnel into where the filter beds would have been. Now it's an underground storage tank here in the filter beds. The filter beds were built in construction stages. Initially, they built the first 3, then added one in 1916, then they added a couple more later on. Very simple approach. This is just a concrete tank, or this case it was a lime concrete tank. We have broken stone at the bottom, sand on it, and you put the water in the top. It would filter down through the sand and come out fresh. That the sand would have microbes on it, which would eat the bad things, and also the sand would filter out all the mud or the floating materials, the particulate in the water. From the filter bed, they had a tunnel through a rock tunnel going through the hillside. Here's the filter bed here, running through the tunnel, 240-meter tunnel to bring the pipe out onto the side of the old Typo Road, and from there it was then came down the valley into Kowloon. As I mentioned, the catchwater. There were 2 initial catchwaters, a 3.2 kilometer one on the back of Beacon Hill. Here's the Beacon Hill tunnel. Here's the KCR tunnel. So the initial back went along there 3.2 kilometers, and there was a little one just coming off the side here. But this catchwater, following a number of dry summers or dry winters, they extended the catchwater another 3.3 kilometers along to pick up more rivers coming off the hillside there. And this is now a very nice walk and exercise area for people. As I mentioned, they built a bungalow for the caretaker. We did have some discussion earlier on about this bungalow. The main part of the bungalow is from the original construction, but WSD did put a new roof on it, a metal, and they changed the metalwork here. They've tried to let it, but because of the monkeys in the area, no one's interested in living in a monkey-infested location, unfortunately. So in terms then of the supply network, as I mentioned, from the filter beds, there was a supply line down to the Lychee filter beds, which then provided water to the boats, and then there was the main coming into town. So they needed a new reservoir to provide the gravity feed, because the pressure head from the reservoir up here would be too big. And so what you do is you feed a tank on the hill, and then that tank locally feeds then into the distribution system. And this is the hill here, the Bishop's Hill or Mission Hill, as we've been talking about. The Lychee cock, the pipe went down to a Lychee cock to a filter beds there. They initially built some filter beds. There'd been an outbreak of cholera, so they were very concerned. So they built some local filter beds and a little storage facility, but they undersized it. And as soon as it was opened, it was they opened it in March 1905, and it was very unsatisfactory. They couldn't get the capacity through, so they had to double the size of everything. And so by June later that year, it was working satisfactorily, and it was then supplying water to all the boats. And there were a couple of private companies then that would fill up here and take the water out to the ships parked in the harbour. So here's then the Kowloon, what it was called Kowloon Tong Tank, or Mission Bishop Hills Tank. It's the same map we have from 1928. So the water came down. The actual tank was a relatively straightforward structure. They just excavated the ground. Then they put a concrete slab down, and then they built up external walls and the stone pillars that we see. It was awarded to a Mr. Shing to build in 1903, and it was planned to complete in June 1904. And they were trying to get it completed early. They offered him a bonus to complete it early, and unfortunately he didn't. He completed it late, but they still managed to get it on stream and start supplying water. In 1952, they did a lot of modification works to the tank. They'd had a lot of leakage on it, and so it was going to change tank. Instead of being a storage tank, it was going to become a brake pressure tank, which it wasn't so necessary to have as much capacity as there was previously. So they basically filled in around the outside and put a new internal wall in, and they did a bit of a cleanup work on the tank and revised the pipe work supporting it. I went up there a couple of years ago, and of course it's quite a community. It was quite a community facility. People enjoying the area and the quietness and a bit of a exercise area. But of course, that didn't last long. As we know, last year, WSD decided the tank was no longer in use. They'd stopped using it, I think it was in 83, 84. It was no longer in use. It was a hassle, so they decided they were going to demolish it. And that's when it became apparent to everybody the importance or the architectural merit of this structure. All right, so they built the reservoir, they built the tanks, they improved the supply schemes, and everything was working well until 1921, when they started to they could no longer supply sufficient water to Kowloon. Hong Kong Island was also struggling. They were on lots of water shortages. They got down to about 3 hours a day with the water. So they then had to have a new plan, and that's when they started building the Xingmun schemes. But that's not today's topic, so we won't go there. So in terms of legacy, the water supply to Kowloon allowed Kowloon to grow and provided a safe environment for the development of what was called British Kowloon and Victoria, and the ongoing development of Hong Kong as a significant trading port in the Far East. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Tymon. Thank you. Yes. Last but not least, we have Mr. Fredo Cheung. Mr. Cheung is the current Vice President of the Hong Kong Institute of Architectural Conservationists, Hong Kong ICON. Prior to his career as a built heritage conservation professional, he practiced in architecture, working for Lee and Orange Architects and Ronald Liu and Partners. Fredo, thank you.
So with Professor Ting having just given us a very good background on the history of Mission Hill, and also Tymon's background from his experience as a civil engineer, I think I'm going to give you a perspective of Bishop Hill from heritage conservation. So when we talk about the actual grading of Bishop Hill, when we talk about grading, we're actually talking about understanding the significance of the heritage structure. So in this case, it's the Mission Hill Service Reservoir. And in many ways, it actually bears remarkable similarities to the conservation process, which our profession actually adopts when we actually look at or appraise heritage assets. And so I'll start my presentation by actually giving you a walkthrough of how the conservation process works. And then I'll give you a background on how we actually go about evaluating the significance of these heritage assets. So which includes the understanding of the significance of place. And then last but not least, I will actually give you a brief understanding of how the heritage assessment mechanism works. So, conserving heritage. How should we go about deciding it and how? Now, of course, if posed with that question, I would say that the stakeholders should decide. But of course, with expert advice from qualified conservation professions after consultation with stakeholders. And we usually go about this in a very systematic way, and which is what we call the conservation process. And so taking a look at the Australian model, the conservation plan by James Semper Kerr. The conservation process is actually very simple. It really entails two major stages, with the first stage being understanding the place, and the second stage being about conservation policy and implementation. So what do we mean by these two stages? So taking a look at how the entire process works. So stage one, when we talk about understanding the heritage place, it's really talking about gathering evidence. So research. Second part is about coordinating and analyzing the evidence at hand. And finally, going about the assessing and stating of the significance of this particular heritage place. And the second stage is about conservation policy and implementation. And that really talks about the, after you've actually gone about understanding the significance of the heritage place, how do you devise a set of policies to actually help ensure that the significance of these heritage assets can be retained? And if this is difficult to understand, we can actually take a look at another version of this conservation process, the Canadian model. Now, the Canadian model, they divide it into 4 key steps, which is understanding the historic place, evaluate significance, assess potential impacts, and develop conservation strategies. So if you actually take a look at these points closely, it actually bears remarkable resemblance to the Australian model, which we've just seen. So in effect, stages A and B are equivalent to the Australian model stage 1. And stage C and D is equivalent to stage 2. But what I like about the Canadian process is that it's actually asking the 4 critical questions when we talk about conservation. What is it we're looking at? Why is it important? What is happening to it? And what are we going to do about it? So when we're talking about Bishop Hill or Mission Hill, and when we talk about grading, we're essentially asking the question of what is it we're looking at? And why is it important? And this sums up what grading is about. So when we talk about grading heritage buildings. So when we evaluate the significance of heritage assets, we're actually looking at values, or specifically the cultural heritage values. And of course, heritage values are the basis of assessing significance of a heritage place, but in simple terms, it actually helps explain why the place is such a big deal, that it warrants conservation or not. And of course, this is actually based on international charters and standards. So taking a look at a few of the international charters. First of all, we have the Venice Charter from 1964. So taking a look at this example, it talks mostly about the historical, aesthetics, and archaeological values. But as we move to 1979 with the Australia ECOMES's Bureau Charter, we see a difference. We see historic, aesthetics, scientific, social, and spiritual. So scientific is actually is identical to archaeological. And the only additional components to the Bureau Charter is really social and spiritual. And this is quite important because it marks a transition of how we actually value heritage. And you see the same changes reflected in, let's say, Canada, with their standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada. So again, you have the same historic, aesthetics, scientific, and social values, which mirrors the approach which the Australians have taken. And this, of course, is also reflected in the 2015, the China Principles, and to a certain extent, also the UK or the English Heritage's Conservation Principles, Policies, and Guidance for Sustainable Management of Historic Environment. But from all these different charters, you can actually see that there are some commonalities. And the commonalities are the historical, architectural, and social values. So in terms of these three key values, you could say that the historical and architectural values are more traditional values. So with the historical, which is talking about the history of the place, the past, association with historical figures, events. When we talk about architecture values, it's really about talking about the physical aspects of the place, the very tangible aspects of it, and which dwells on the artistic, the aesthetics, and the design value. But then we have social value, which we would call contemporary values. And this is more about the connection of the place to the people in the present. So the intangible and the living. So how is the place connected with the people in the present? So if we are to look at the historic building assessment criteria in Hong Kong, so specifically the AMO's criteria for grading historic buildings, you can also see this change happening. So from 2002 to 2008, criteria was mainly focused on the historic and the architectural values. Whereas in 2008, we see a change. So we see the addition of social values, which is a contemporary value. So when we talk about understanding significance of a heritage place, one of the key things is that we need to actually come up with a statement of significance, and which really stems from our understanding of the values. So the statement of significance of a heritage place is really an assessment of the special qualities, which makes the place important for conservation. So if we actually look at Canada's standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places, the statement of significance of a heritage place really consists of these two key components. So first of all, it's about understanding the place, and which is to provide a background information. So which entails research and providing contextual information for the place. So it's historical, architectural, and social backgrounds. And then the second part is really about assessing the heritage place itself, the statement of significance, and which provides a description of the place. You establish the heritage values of the place using the three common values which we just talked about. And of course, identifying what we call the character defining elements, the CDEs of the place. So these are tangible or intangible elements that should be conserved. So with Professor Ting's insight and also Tymon's presentation, what is the significance of Bishop Hill Service Reservoir? Well, if I was to sum it up, I would say that, first of all, it is an integral part of the historic Kowloon Waterworks gravitational scheme, the Kowloon Reservoir system. This is a highly significant piece of waterworks infrastructure which paved the way for the development of Kowloon Peninsula by addressing the fundamental issue of supplying fresh water to residents. And secondly, its unique construction is actually a testament to the ingenuity of the late 19th century, early 20th century engineering. So you see some experimental use of concrete, which was considered a relatively new material at the time because it was just rediscovered. And of course, Bishop Hill and the Kowloon Reservoir also stands as a lasting testament to the skills and craftsmanship of the local stonemasons, a trade which has long since been in decline. And most of the skills and craftsmanship have already been lost over time. And of course, more importantly, if we look at the social values, Bishop Hill is actually situated on this hill Mission Hill, Bishop Hill, which is actually a popular communal recreation space in Shek Kip Mei. And it is highly significant to the local community today. So let's take a look at the assessment mechanism of how we actually go about assessing heritage in Hong Kong. So to actually understand how heritage is positioned in, let's say, the Hong Kong development framework, okay? In the past, the Antiquities and Monuments Office is actually placed under, let's say, culture. So it actually falls under LCSD. But because of change in policy, heritage conservation is now framed under development. And which is why, if you look at this particular chart of the Development Bureau, you'll see that the Antiquities Monuments Office is actually under Development Bureau, directly under, or actually under the Secretary for Development. And then you have the Commissioner for Heritage's office at the top. And of course, the Antiquities Advisory Board over here. So what does this framework tell us? So basically what it tells us is that the Commissioner of Heritage's office, the CHO, is really about policy making. So the role of the CHO is to interface development and conservation at a policy level, to implement monitor policies on heritage conservation and devise new initiatives on heritage conservation. As for AMO, their role is really about implementation. So doing the bread and butter work of actual conservation, the documentation of heritage assets, and also fostering public awareness. As for the role of the Antiquities Advisory Board, as the name implies, their role is strictly advisory in nature. So they advise the Antiquities Authority, which is the Secretary for Development, on declared monuments, proposed monuments, and graded buildings. And of course, they also advise the Secretary for Development on heritage conservation policies. So for our actual heritage grading system, as we all know, our system comprises of these 3 tiers: grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3. So grade 1 means buildings of outstanding merit, in which every effort should be made to preserve it, if possible. So for grade 2, it's really talk about buildings of special merit, and effort should be made to selectively preserve it. As of grade 3, it's buildings of some merit. Preservation in some form would be desirable, and alternative means could be considered if preservation is not practical. Now, it's actually very difficult to actually visualize, that what these 3 grades mean, or how to differentiate one from the other. So let's just take a look at the 3 pictures below. Think of it as in terms of intervention, the level of intervention you can have on these old buildings. So on the far left, you have the blue house. And in the middle, you have the, I think the old quarters for the waterworks staff at the, I think at HKU, at the waterworks in HKU. And on the far right, it's the old Wan Chai market. So these photos were taken in sometime in the mid-90s, I think. So pay attention to these photos and see what happens to them over the years. So you can actually see the level of intervention. So with grade 1 and grade 2, you don't actually see a lot of intervention. So the integrity of the fabric is pretty much kept intact. So not many changes. So in fact, if you look at the example in the middle, most of the changes actually happened within the building. But whereas with the example on the right, the old Wan Chai market, which is quite unfortunate, you have a building plunked on top of it. So with heritage conservation perspective, we don't see this as a very good example of conservation. In fact, we would call this facadism. So yeah, this gives you an idea of the level of intervention. So you can think of it in terms of how much intervention you can actually achieve with each of these. I think this is another way of actually looking at it when it comes to grading. So this actually brings us to one of the first issues, when we talk about the current assessment framework, and also maybe talk about grading. So if you look at how our grading system is worded, focus on the word buildings. So it's all about buildings. Whereas if you actually look at other jurisdictions in the world, it's much more diversified. So it encompasses, let's say, archaeological sites, design landscapes, battlefields, even movable heritage such as transportations like trains, buses. But in Hong Kong, we're still focused on buildings. So let's put that aside for now, and we look at the two-tiered heritage grading process. So when we talk about how we go about actually assessing and grading these heritage assets, the AAB is actually responsible for the assessment. And this is done at the behest of the Antiquities and Monuments Office, AMO. And it's through this, what we call the two-tiered process. So in stage one, the AAB members are all given this historic building assessment form, which lists a set of criteria and a scoring system to actually help quantify significance. And so what are these criteria? So it's basically listed on that box in the top right corner. Historic interest, architectural merits, group values, social values, local interests, authenticity, and rarity. And once this is done, the scores will then be processed in stage two, and then where there will be a comparative rating of the buildings, which are carried out based on the following three parameters: historical, typological, and contextual. I won't get into details of stage two because I think what's more pertinent in my talk actually focuses on stage one. So if we actually deep dive into the criteria, okay, historic interest is actually quite self-explanatory. So it's essentially talking about historical values. So again, historical events, historical figures, and then also its importance to the historical development of Hong Kong. And more interestingly, it talks about the age of buildings. So age is a factor. And the second is, of course, architectural merit, which is identical to architectural values or aesthetic values. So it's talking about aesthetics, which implies style, and then the function of the building. So what example or building type is this about? And then about construction. So which entails design, decoration, construction materials, and technology. And which of course is where the Mission Hill Service Reservoir comes in, because it is a piece of infrastructure engineering. And of course, aesthetic values, the building's external appearance, visual quality. And as we get to the third one, this one is quite interesting. We have group value. I would consider this more of as an architectural value, because if you look at how it's worded, it's talking about the importance in a building cluster of harmonious architectural design and style of Hong Kong, or an integral component of an historic complex. Now, this one is actually quite interesting because it's talking about a building cluster, but on the basis of its architectural style and design. But this actually raises an interesting question, because with Bishop Hill, the service reservoir there, if we talk about groupings, nothing within the vicinity of Bishop Hill actually matches the kind of architecture style which you see in that particular reservoir, the arches, the Romanesque revival arches, things like that. Instead, if we're actually to talk about group values, it's really about its association with the Kowloon Reservoir itself. So is it such a good idea to actually place so much emphasis on architectural design and style when we talk about group values? This actually raises an interesting question. And then when we talk about social values, of course, we think about its relevance to society today. But interestingly, if we look at how the assessment is actually written, or at least the first bullet point, it talks about the importance as a symbolic or visual landmark. Visual landmark. So again, that's another cue for architecture, design, and style. And then of course, authenticity, we don't actually consider it actually as a value, but rather it's any heritage building. The intent of heritage conservation is actually to maintain authenticity of the heritage itself. And rarity, of course, is an architectural value because you're looking at rarity from the perspective of its architectural design. So if we just look at these 6 criteria, you will notice that of the 6, already 3 of them actually places emphasis on aesthetics, architecture. But then, as we know, with Mission Hill, the service reservoir, it's really a piece of infrastructure, a piece of engineering. Its significance lies not in its architectural design, but rather the fact that it is a very significant piece of engineering. So again, let's take out the sheet again. So again, besides the focus on just buildings, we're talking about a criteria, which puts a lot of emphasis on aesthetics and style. And of course, the criterion of group values is also focused on aesthetics as opposed to function, functional relations. And this also explains why, when AMO first announced the 5 historic structures at the Kowloon Reservoir as declared monuments on January 2020, they focused on the tangible. And these 5 examples, or these historic structures, were selected primarily because of the visual, the aesthetic considerations. And which in a way explains why Bishop Hill was left out, the service reservoir, because first of all, because of distance, it's quite far away. And secondly, the service reservoir is underground, you can't see it. And of course, when we talk about this 2-tier heritage grading process, one should actually note that the AAB, or actually AMO, actually attempted to classify different historical building types. And in fact, they came up with a list of 34 different types of heritage assets. But what's interesting about this list is that despite the fact that they consider all these heritage assets, where actually they assess it as buildings, some of these heritage types don't quite fit the bill. For example, cemetery and graves, waterworks, which is technically a piece of engineering. And the worst example you have is commemorative stones, plaques, inscriptions, etc. So this already raises another question. How can you assess these 3 types of heritage when your assessment mechanism was designed to only assess architecture? So if I was to sum up the assessment criteria, I would say that the Hong Kong solution is actually a one-size-fits-all solution. it's based on the assumption that a single set of criteria for assessing all heritage types, and that it's suitable to be applied to all the different heritage typologies which exist here in Hong Kong. But unfortunately, it does not have a guideline to address the idiosyncrasies of these individual heritage typologies. If we look at how it's actually done overseas, let's say taking UK as an example, when you go about grading heritage assets, they don't call it grading, but they call it listing. But to actually guide the person who is responsible for doing the assessments, they actually come up with individual set of guidelines to guide the person to actually through the grading process. And notice one of them is actually infrastructure, utilities, and communication, which is applicable to, let's say, the scenario which we have on our hands, Bishop Hill Service Reservoir. So the way they actually go about doing it in UK is that they develop 44 sets of selection criteria and listing guidelines. So 20 of which relates to building types. And even when we talk about infrastructure, they have 2 different types, so utilities and communications and transport. And of course, they also have something as small as, let's say, street furniture, which will address things like street signs, historic street signs, or even, let's say, historic roads, pavements. And there are 18 different types for design landscapes, one specific one for a historic battlefield, and even one for historic ship. And these guidelines are actually quite important because they provide guidance to people who are actually doing the assessment. And of course, in Hong Kong, we don't actually have this kind of guideline to actually guide the AAB members to actually go about doing the assessment systematically. So again, this raises the 2 other issues, and which is our one-size-fits-all approach. And of course, notion of infrastructure versus architecture building. So you can actually assess waterworks strictly on the grounds of architectural aesthetics. It doesn't quite work because it's a piece of engineering. It was designed by an engineer because Lawrence Gibbs is a member of the Institute of Civil Engineers. And also, more importantly, infrastructures are a completely different animal. It's systemic in nature. It's not like buildings where you can actually assess it one by one. When you look at waterworks infrastructure, you have to look at it in terms of a system and understand how it works. So this brings me to a conclusion. So in the context of, let's say, the Mission Hill incident, there's a general need to actually adopt very specific set of guidelines for, let's say, grading infrastructure heritage, which addresses, the systemic complexity of infrastructure heritage, and also the need for devise some set of guidance on how to approach the assessment of these infrastructure heritage in a systematic way. And this is very important because if you don't actually have a set of guidelines to guide AAB members, there will be problem with consistency. Because the AAB members, they do actually have a finite, limit. They actually serve a term, and then there will be new AAB members coming in to replace them after a certain number of years. How do you ensure that there is going to be consistency with this iteration of AAB members versus decision made by the next iteration of AAB members? And this is why we need a set of guidelines. And in the larger context, the whole incident here actually reveals that we actually need to revamp the current assessment framework. So to provide typological specific grading guidelines, and more importantly, to involve heritage conservation practitioners who are well-versed in heritage conservation. So this concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Fredo. I'll let you take a break, and you can have some coffee and water before we start asking you questions. Okay, we have questions coming in, and can I start with Dr. Ting? I think this question refers to when you had the slide with the other Chinese characters quoted from Wikipedia. The question is there any reason why the Mission Hill had different location names in the news from the Wikipedia record you came up with?
Can we go back to that?
Okay, the second question, while Alice is helping you, where did the cemeteries and squatters relocated between 1957 and 1972?
I don't think they are relocated, but they were actually removed, because starting, I think people may remember that in the December of 1953, we have this fire in Shek Kip Mei. And after that, the government decided to build resettlement buildings. So, in the course of time, a lot of resettlement buildings were built in many areas of Kowloon and some in Hong Kong as well. And so these squatters were removed eventually, but it took quite a long time, actually. I think even in the late 70s, we still see some squatters along the slopes of some hills in Hong Kong and Kowloon. So that took quite a long time, but they were removed. They are not relocated because of we have the resettlement scheme. Lots of buildings. 6-story high H-shaped buildings were built. The only remaining one is Mei Ho House. So if you're interested, you could go to Shek Kip Mei, and the Mei Ho House has been converted into a youth hostel, and with an exhibition featuring the history of the place and the history of resettlement buildings in Hong Kong.
Okay, thank you. I'll come back to you with the other question.
Well, I think that the newspaper, they include Hoa Kiu Yat Bo. No, the end. The last one. The end. Okay, just a minute. Include Hoa Kiu Yat Bo and then Tai Kung Bo. So it's about some news. The first one is about they discover a lot of graves on this Mission Hill and in Shek Kip Mei, as well as in Seoul Chun in Seoul. And the second one is nobody care about the squatters. Well, I think probably there was sort of a fire, but after that, nobody bothered about the squatters. So the Hoa Kiu Yat Bo sort of covered that news in 1963, and in 1968, the villagers, they actually built their own generator on top of on the Mission Hill again, and well, eventually in 1972, 1,900 people who used to reside in Mission Hill was sort of vacated. It was removed, and the last one is about a rape case, and in that happened in 1977, and probably yes, on Mission Hill. So it's all about the newspaper coverage of something that happened on that hill. So they call it Gaoweishan Mission Hill instead of Bishop Hill. The trouble with Bishop Hill is that actually there wasn't any bishop. We can't find any bishop there because of all the I think only the Anglican Church have a bishop apart from the Catholic bishops. So I don't think the Pastor Mission had any bishop. So I see no reason why that hill should be named Bishop Hill. But it's very evidently it should be called Mission Hill because of the Basel House.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Ting. And we have a question for Tymon.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Is it correct to say the Mission Hill Reservoir took 11 years to build, but it worked only for less than 10 years when water famine started in 1920?
No. Yeah, it took only 2 years to build the reservoir, the service reservoir. It should have taken only a year, but it took 2 years. And then it was in use up until I think it was into the 70s, 60, 90, yeah. Oh, sorry, April 1984 it was in use. So it continued in use. The problem with these sorts of structures is that they're susceptible to leakage. They tend to leak a lot as they get older, and the costs of maintenance become more expensive than the operations. They also become, if it was operated as a service reservoir, size does become important as you start supplying more customers, because it has to fill up more often. So you want a bigger and bigger unit. So if you look, some of the modern reservoirs are significantly larger than that sort of one. But no, it was in use for a long time. The real problem for Hong Kong, obviously, is just the storage of water. We need to store lots of water, and so it was the Kowloon Reservoir that became the weak part of the link there. It just couldn't store enough water during the wet season, so they had to start building more reservoirs, which became the Xingmen works. And also then the remains of the reservoirs down the Kowloon catchment area.
And I guess this leads to the next question. Why particularly was this reservoir built underground instead of...
Yes, that's a good question. The cheapest way to build a reservoir is on a flat pit of ground. But of course, it wouldn't work as a reservoir because you want to stick it on the top of a hill. And of course, most slopes in Hong Kong aren't flat, so you tend to dig the reservoirs into the hillside to give you a flat base. So if you go and look on sort of Hong Kong Island, you'll see the reservoirs sticking out the hillside effectively. It costs more to dig a hole and put one in initially, but it makes it easier. It hides them away, it gives them a constant temperature, and it means you can do other things around there. So it has some merit in burying these things, but it does cost more initially. So I think if you go to lots of other countries where they don't care so much about aesthetics of things, you'll see them just stuck there on hillsides or on posts and things. In the UK, in the flatlands, they'll stick them up on concrete posts and things. Service reservoir. It's all to match in with the environment. And Bishop Hill, they only dug the ground out, and it wouldn't have been a difficult dig, so it wouldn't have been a huge expense. Although they did hit some problems, which is why it clearly went a bit later. It was about a year late than it should have been, or 6 months perhaps.
Okay, great, thank you. And Fredo, obviously everyone is curious about the current status of Bishop Hill Service Reservoir, whether it's been listed or going to be listed as grade 1.
I think from what we understand, it is now currently grade 1. And it's important to note that I think, as Douglas So pointed out in his last press conference, grade 1 is actually, another way to look at it is that it is a list of potential future declared monuments.
Okay, and then the other question is, shouldn't the government or certain departments or group be more proactive in identifying heritage buildings or sites instead of kind of, how should I say this? they should identify buildings before something happens to them.
Well, I think it's easy to actually to blame the government for not doing enough, and but it has to be realized that the Antiquities and Monuments Office is just an office. They're not a government department, and there's a difference because the Antiquities Monuments Office is staffed only by, I think, at most 126 personnel at this particular moment, and we have about 8,888 heritage assets, and this list is still growing. Yeah, so it's been further limited to, let's say, there's a further study, and then it's been down to 1,444. But again, that list is still growing. So you can imagine, place with the stress of actually to assess, this amount of heritage. It's very difficult for the government to actually cope at this stage, unless they expand the Antiquities Monuments Office.
We need more people like you, basically, right? Right.
Yes. Well, I think that brings up, maybe that raises another question. So I think currently the staff who are actually in the Antiquities and Monuments Office, well, many of them actually have a background in, let's say, as curators, but they don't actually have an extensive background in heritage conservation. And these are two very different disciplines. So if they are to be placed in the position to assess heritage, it's important that they attain the right qualifications to actually go about doing it. So I would say that heritage conservation education is actually very important. And that's something which also needs to be addressed.
Okay, last question. Do you think that the grading criteria will be changed?
Well, I think I'm hoping that there will be changes because, well, I think the Development Bureau has actually acknowledged that the system is not perfect. And they've made that clear in the last press statement as well with Douglas. So we'll have to adopt a wait and see attitude. And we hope that they would actually approach, let's say, heritage conservation professions for advice as well, because at this stage, they've consulted members of the Hong Kong Institute of Architects, the Institute of Surveyors, and possibly engineering as well. But to this date, they have not actually approached HKICON. And we're actually the de facto professional organization responsible for heritage conservation.
Yeah, I think you should voice this, right?
Yeah, we've already
totally
done that.
putting Fredo on the spot.
Yeah, well, we've done it, and then we have some initial response from CHO, and I think at this moment it's still it's inconvenient for them because they're still in the middle of managing, what's happening with Bishop Hill. So I think in the near future, it's very likely that maybe they will meet with us, and then let's see what we can move on from there. Of course, the position of our institute is that we're always going to do our best to actually help the government whenever we can, especially in matters related to heritage conservation.
Great, thank you. Well, we sincerely hope that the Bishop Hill Service Reservoir will be safe for us to visit, and we can arrange a guided tour for everyone in the near future. Okay. Sorry, I lied. We have one more question from Tymon.
Okay, hold on.
Okay, promise this is the last one. Okay, among the hills in the vicinity in Sham Shui Po, why has Bishop Hill been chosen as the site of the service reservoir? This is for Tymon.
A good question. I don't know. Well, I suspect because it's the proximity to where the communities were going to be, and also the height. You want to get a reasonable height above where you're going to be supplying water to minimize costs for distribution. And it was a convenient hill. It was right next to the Typo Road, so it makes the pipe work easier. So I suspect just convenience is the bottom line on that one. And it's probably the most prominent hill in the area. All the other hills were much lower. As we can see, many of them have now been removed for future development. So good luck is probably the real answer. It was just in the right place at the right time.
Good answer. Great, thank you. That concludes our talk for today. Once again, thank you to our three distinguished speakers, Dr. Ting, Mr. Mellor, Fredo. Thank you very much for your time. And thank you for all of you for joining our talk today. The Hong Kong New Museum Society's next event is a guided tour of an exhibition on Congolese paintings at UMAG, and Florian will be, the director will be taking us on that tour. That's on next Saturday, 17th. Please feel free to browse our website for the latest news and exhibitions. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend and stay safe. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.